Podcast.
Welcome to the PeaceSum Podcast. I'm your host, Pete Ellis, and today I've got an awesome producer all the way from, from this area, but all the way in, where are you at, sir? Colorado, right? But
Breckenridge, Colorado these days.
Breckenridge, Colorado. Sorry, I should know that. I told somebody else it was Boulder, and I was like, I don't think that's right. But anyway, so this producer, we've worked together for a few years now. We have a really interesting relationship. We'll get a little bit into that in the future of the podcast, but I'm super thankful to have him on, and I appreciate you taking the time, Mr. Joe Mccarty. How are you doing?
Doing great, man. Thanks so much for the invite. It's a pretty cool opportunity. As long as I've been making music and as engaged as I've been in technology, I've actually never done any live recording out of the studio for anything other than tutorials or conversations on production. So this is kind of a neat experience.
Awesome. Yeah, it's funny how we go into different branches, everybody. You know, it's like music is such a big, and now it's with social media and video and production and all that. I mean, it's such a big area that you can get lost in very niche areas of expertise and never even touch a whole different side of things that is interesting, and you might like to do it. You just don't have the time to do all of the different things.
Absolutely. Yeah, I feel like the more you learn, the more you realize, the less you know with everything in life, and it's the same with music. So then you quickly start seeing opportunities that you could get lost in and spend lots of time on that topic. Maybe I was fortunate early on that I had a strong passion for audio, and when I dove in and finally went for a little bit of education, my focus, of course, was so simple. It was like, I just want to make better music and maybe be a good DJ. And then I saw the audio industry, and it was like, hey, here's all this other stuff that is also audio. And so then that was great, right? Seeing like film design and sound design and recording for TV. And this was like, oh, okay, there's so much else that's audio and not just being a good DJ.
It's not just music. Yeah, I mean, from podcasts to conferences to live sound to just, I mean, there's so many, like you said, film scores, all of that stuff. I mean, it is pretty amazing how many different avenues there are for music, and it also is kind of like, it's crazy that it's so hard to find those placements.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot. There's like a lot going on, from TV shows to movies to, commercials. Like the other day I was hearing a commercial, I can't remember what it was. I think it was for a car, and Immortal Technique was the instrumental in the background, one of his songs. Nice. And I was like, oh, that's interesting that that they're using that. Oh, am I losing you?
No, it's my mistake. I hit a button there.
Okay. All right, so yeah, just seeing that's something that I think opened my eyes when I got into music more, for trying to find places to put my music, was like, oh, like I wasn't thinking about commercial making or product making, and it's interesting because as a kid we did this. I don't know if you guys did, but in school we had to come up with a commercial to sell soap. Did you guys do something like that?
I didn't, but my older brother was involved in having to make a video commercial, and I was his actor when I was a kid, so
kind of in the same, you had to do something along those lines, right?
Similar.
Yeah, so it's funny, because, that's something that, you would sell, people need it, and you don't think that, like, oh, that needs music. And so, yeah, I just, as you get further into it, you're like, oh man, like if I can make something that's on this line, or do I have something I've already made that fits this? And then one of the producers I worked with for Find My Way, he had this interesting thing of like, how do I add like things that are universal, of like, fresh, and like, you can use fresh in a lot of things. You can use it for toothpaste, to soap, to all kinds of different things. So having kind of like in your production tool belt when you're making an instrumental, and then going a step further of like, where am I gonna place this instrumental, having a couple different options that would allow you to kind of custom tailor very easily where it might go to.
Yeah, there's definitely so many avenues. You talk about production and how to get started with your own style or design, and all of that is so personal, but it's kind of an experience that brings you to the place of your own production, and that's a bit of a journey that's personal too. Then it's unique to the individual. Some people are performers and musicians. Other people are inspired technicians, and depending how you come out of it, kind of determines your role in the industry. But that's what's great, right? There's so many roles in the industry, and I think you can be eager and satisfied in a number of avenues. Even, for example, now I work as a stagehand and front of house mix engineer at a performing arts theater down in Vail, and that's something that came to me through way of my schooling, through going to college and becoming a music recording engineer. And so it's basically working with live audio and setting up for recording. And that's one of those things where it's not what I wake up and get excited and happy about in the day, but it always keeps me sharp in my craft and keeps showing me new things and helps me to come home into my studio and improve in certain areas and gives me inspiration. So that and the fact that I'm then around professional musicians and other stuff gives me some pretty sharp inspiration and stuff to draw back on. And I mention it simply to say, in the earlier part of the conversation, talking about seeing these different avenues in audio is valuable because you can learn from all of them and bring that back into what you do and hopefully improve your style of production and your quality of product.
Absolutely, it's nice to be getting paid in the field of music too.
Yeah, exactly.
That really boosts the confidence in what you're doing. I might not be making music or making money on music I'm creating necessarily, but when I'm making money doing this, I'm still doing music and I'm making a living doing it. And that was something that where is success to you? I asked this rhetorically, but you can answer in a second if you'd like. I mean it when I was younger, success was I want to be this super rock star, right? But as I've gotten older and more realistic and I've been down the road a bit, I'm well, it would be nice to be able to make a living doing what I enjoy doing, right? That's kind of my success has kind of changed over the years.
Yeah, dude, I can't tell you, without getting too personal, how many times I've kind of revisioned my goal or, you know what I mean? Revisioned my life. Where am I going? What's the purpose here? Where am I in the industry, if at all? And I think, early on, I just was a glory-struck kid who wanted to be a DJ or a powerful producer, right? Making really awesome music and potentially performing it. But part of the maturing process was this realizing at some point, I think it was maybe 2008 or something like that, and I was invested in this project of a personal design to make sample packs and loops, and it was I started waking up every day and just hitting the studio and doing my grind and kind of realizing, there are other avenues for me to release my productivity without necessarily being the top 10, top 100 DJ producer type guy. And that actually is another great way to learn and train and teach yourself. So that's something that I started out doing. And then, just kind of seeing an avenue for that helped me learn.
Cool, man. Cool. So let's take a step backwards. We met through a mutual friend, Matt Schaefer. Hey, how's it going, man? Long time no see. Hope to hear from you soon. Hope you're well. So he brings me over to your place when you're in New Lenox, I believe. And you've got a little studio in the basement. I wouldn't say little. It's a nice, modest studio with an unbelievable selection of MIDI instrumentation through. Were you using Reason Rewire at the time? I think.
I know I had 2 different computers in there, and it was a pretty powerful build even for the day and time. But yeah, it was mostly being run back through FL Studio in those days.
Yeah, and it was so unbelievable to me that it just stuck out really. Like I've been building my studio space for, I mean, at least 15 years, right? And we're talking probably 7 to 10 years ago already, right? Like, how long ago did we meet?
That was well, I was out of there by 2011 or 2012. Yeah, beginning of 2012. So it would have been 2011 or 2010, and I'm thinking it probably was like 10 or 11 years ago.
Yeah, so yeah, no, I guess I've been building my studio since I was like 19, 18 years old. So I'm 36 now. That's almost 20 years. I'm like 10 years, 15 years.
Wow.
No, it's like the time goes, you know.
You might have one on me. You might have one on me in that because I didn't mess with computers at first. I just had turntables, and I didn't get my first computer until 2005.
So
2004.
I didn't have a computer. So I got my first keyboard that I still have when I was maybe 16, 17. I got like a Yamaha receiver, all the audio stuff to be able to play the stuff once you have it recorded, right? And then it kept growing. And my first piece of equipment that I bought for myself to record was a Zoom 4-track recorder. So there was no computer. It was just the Zoom 4-track. And when I filled it up, I didn't have a way to export it. I didn't know how to even get it off of the thing. So then I needed to get the computer, and all of that started coming after that. But it was no like thought process into how I was going to do all of this. It was like, I just want to do this. Well, how do I start? And it started with the 4-track recorder.
Yeah, hopefully you start with some inspiration, and then you figure out the unfortunate reality of technology and
and it never ceases to be a battle. It just always, there's something always.
I'm jealous of the kid who walks around with his mobile phone and makes beats on that, and it's an all-inclusive package.
Yeah, it's like I've got thousands of dollars and all this different equipment, and it's like he just has this phone and he's killing it, and I'm like, how does this? I don't know. Part of me, I think. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say, part of me, I think that it's when you were immersed into technology. So like our family from before us, they had very little in technology, so they didn't really dive in like we did, right? But the new people since us, they were born with this stuff. Like there was a time where you and I we didn't have computers, we didn't have cell phones, all that stuff. But these kids, they were born and raised with it, and so I think that really does make a difference.
It's integrated more in society now than it was even then.
I struggle with that on my own because it's funny that I came up and became very technical in my own career and in life, but now I strive to sort of understand as a human what's the philosophy behind living on this planet, and what would it be like, for example, to de-technify and go live out off the grid, which is kind of like how things have been going for me for a while, first getting into mountaineering and then sort of, fantasizing about that for a time. But I am an audio engineer, and here I am kind of like neck deep in the technical world. But there's a part of me that's always like, gosh, wouldn't it be neat to see what I could do with that electricity? I'm just not a musician, so unfortunately not a whole lot. Maybe I could record a few beats or something, but that's the nature of it. But anyway, it's nice to take that step back and think on that and say, hey, I was raised in a family who was brought up in technology. I wasn't given the choice as a kid. Do you want technology, or do you want to try and live an austere lifestyle, slightly different? And so because it was then a part of life, it takes a time to take a step back and think on it before you're just acting out and doing these things naturally, impulsively, or however kids are. But from a standpoint of people being more integrated and more immersed, they'll probably improve their skill set, right? Maybe a kid from today may be better in 10 years than like we were, having gotten new to it from outside. Somebody that uses it more maybe can craft new ideas and think new ways or something. So there's potential there.
And I do believe that that's the case, is that you think new ways, like the innovations that come from the technologies are directly correlated to who's using them. So the chip, right? Like an Intel chip comes out, well, who's using it and what do they need it for? And then that application gets put into the revisions in the next generations. And so, like, you know, if you're you know, a person who they're only using it for watching TV, well, you don't need as much maybe as someone who's recording audio and video and multiple sources, and you know what I mean? Like, so you just have this different different viewpoint when you have the actual users giving the feedback. And I think that it takes the new technology to come about before we can even know what's possible with that technology. You know what I mean? Like with the old Apple iPhone, the first one that came out, like they weren't thinking about live streaming on that thing. You know what I mean? But the idea came from people using that thing and being like, wouldn't it be cool if we could also do this?
Yeah, absolutely. Platforms are powerful and versatile. Even the current monthly in Future Music Magazine is talking about have softwares become overdeveloped for hardwares. And, you know, think about, for example, these type of presets where a kid presses one note and he's composing like 5 different arpeggio parts and pretty much has a song under his fingertips, you know, versus the days where, like, if you fired up an FM synthesizer in 1985, you know, your high achievement was making like 2 and 3 timbre tones, and or you know what I mean, like just totally different wavetable sounds and things like that. So that's interesting. Yeah, and not to get too deep on that, I would say not to get too deep on that topic because that's definitely my area of interest and expertise. But when I was in school, one thing that I was forced to do was focus on certain areas of the industry, and so we wrote reports. And one of the reports and research that I ended up doing, which is of course right up my alley, was on the hardware technology that was developed by certain companies and how it was used and misused or abused to create what we pretty much call genres. And so my real focus was the era from the 70s into the 80s, and specifically to do with rhythmic accompaniment and drum machines. And so I talked all about the birth of hip-hop, the birth of house, and how these things basically came from guys who took machines that were developed for a different purpose and then reused them for their own design. And the purpose that they were reused for, which is what we know them for, isn't really what the manufacturer designed. So specifically talk about the Roland 808 drum machine. Those things were really, really expensive when they were released in the early 80s, and they were only purchased by studios who could afford a $2,000 drum machine. Fast forward about 4 or 5 years when they kind of fell out of popularity with the studios, they were basically taken down to the pawn stores where suddenly someone could buy it for $200 and $300, and now you have your hip-hop producer, your rap producer in those eras pretty much getting their hands on these machines and taking them to the streets and saying, boom, like, how can we make some beats with this? Like, what can we do? Boom. Breakbeat was hot. That's what they did on vinyl, and they started doing it in a physical fashion. So fast forward again, and the whole point of that is simply to say, people taking a technology and then kind of like figuring out how they want to use it on their own, different from maybe what the manufacturer had intended, is the birth and spirit of soul, and like exactly how humans influence sound through technology, right? We are harnessing electricity, but ultimately we're doing it to a musical design, you know, and especially in the Western world where we're all trying to make harmonies and things like that. So
well, even beyond harmonies, the effects of, like, you know, the turntables and stuff, you know, like from, you know, you're just supposed to play that, don't scratch it, don't mess up the record, don't mess up the needle, and then, you know, and then that comes along as being like a core DJ staple. And like, obviously that's not how it was intended, but now they make scratch records. Now they make, you know, like what I've got the Z2 Tractor Scratch mixer, and you've got time-coded vinyl.
Very cool.
You know, and now they make the needles for, you know, specifically for scratching that lasts longer, but they dig into the record a little bit more, but like you're doing it for a purpose. And if you're using time-coded vinyl, you just buy a new vinyl and you're not ruining an old vinyl. So yeah, I mean, the technology adapting to the user, that's, I mean, that we've seen that firsthand our whole life, and I think that's one of the most amazing things of technology is when the manufacturers see, oh, we've got this market here, and they need this, and they actually do that. That's pretty amazing. So I have a Blackmagic ATEM Mini switcher. It's a 4-video switcher input, and now they've made an ISO and an ISO Pro. That they basically did the same thing. This same exact box, they just did different upgrade features and put buttons in different spaces. They've allowed now to be able to record and stream from that same box. You know, it costs a lot more money. Mine costs $300. The ISO I think is like $1,000. But when you add into then the Rodecaster, the cloner device I've got sending out, all the different little peripherals that I do that are included into that ISO already, I mean, you pretty much have, you know, it's just trading. Do you have the money all at once, or do you have to build it step by step? And that's been my experience, is building my studio step by step, never really knowing exactly the direction I'm going to have to go until I get there.
Yeah.
And, you know, maybe if I had a little more foresight, things might be a little bit cleaner, might be a little bit more compact and into, you know, because like Matt, he's got the MPC 1, I believe. That thing is amazing. I mean, the things that it can do in this one box, it's like its own standalone computer box. I mean, it's amazing. Cool. And so, like, you know, in hindsight, wouldn't it have been nice if I had just saved up and got something like that rather than... Yeah. You know, the Akai MP16 and the Tomcat and all these other different drum machines that I got that are cool, but like are very limited in the terms of where technology is now.
Yeah, I mean, dude, you learn by doing, and stuff comes and goes. I definitely have things that are the very first things that I bought that I've kept, and then I have a lot of stuff that I can tell you about that I don't have in here anymore because I got rid of it and it seemed... you know, not as useful to me anymore, but, you know, it's important too as you build your workflow, you're figuring that out, right? So, yeah, but like in my own case, as far as actually acquiring things, I also didn't start out with a great vision for anything super big. This would have been 2006 when I bought my first hardware. I just decided, okay, I need a pair of speakers. I need an interface so that I can come from the computer to the speakers, and think that's what got me started. And then I said, oh boy, wouldn't it be nice to play a few MIDI notes? And so I got this little Axiom 25. It's actually still sitting here, my MIDI controller from 2006. Definitely outdated and you know, kind of defunct in some areas, but I still like it. Get rid of that stuff when it still works. You know, it feels really good. I have great weighted keys, and so I've never gotten off of it. But like I also have a synthesizer that I can use for MIDI control, so I can do 66 keys if I need 2 hands or a second octave. But yeah, those were some of the first purchases, and I mention them because at that point in time in my life, I was still a bit of a party boy, and I used to get a paycheck, and then I'd watch it come and go, and it was like, man, how does it? You know, I never have any money, and what did I have to show for when the paycheck came and went? Nothing. Some concert or rave I had gone to. And then I can remember buying my first studio hardware, something physical and tangible, and I put it on the desk, and you know, I'd look at it weeks or months later, and I'd think, oh, isn't that neat? I got money from that paycheck 4 months ago, and I put it on something, and it's still there. This stuff lasts a lot longer than that last bag of weed. And so that was where I started looking at the investment, and I can remember finally saying, like, okay, I've spent $600 or whatever. That's actually worth more than the $600 I spent partying over the last half a year. And then boom, I had this stuff in the studio, and I could work with it. It was a tool. So that's kind of my story on how that started.
The tools are amazing. It's good to have that stuff. They last. I mean, I tell people all the time, because, you know, if you don't have a passion, if you don't have like something that you're working towards, you're just kind of like living mundanely through life. But when you have like something, you're like, this is amazing here, I want to do this, and I need to find ways to do it, and you have that passion, you can like, it's become the addiction. Buying equipment and doing all these different things has become the replacement for those years of being wild and reckless. It's like, okay, I found something to kind of harness that energy. And I'm thankful for that for myself. Like, music has taken me down some crazy roads, but I do feel like it's kind of really reined me in as a person and made me whole and better rounded. As far as like, I've developed so many different skills that I never would have imagined needing until I got into making music.
I mean, if I'm looking at life from a very holistic kind of primordial standpoint, I gotta say there's just a few things I've learned in this world or in this experience, and one of them is that music is good. It is not bad. Almost all experiences surrounding music tend to be okay. I could elaborate on that, but yeah, that's basically the gist of it. And so obviously I myself have had fun on the musical journey of meeting other people and playing with them and recording and this and that, especially because I never considered myself a musician. I'm just not that good at what I do as a musician, but more of a performer from like a different standpoint, or a producer or whatever. But then also,
it's weird. It's weird what we have like as far as what we think we are, because I would consider you a musician. It's just not the traditional. I play guitar, or I sing, or whatever. You know what I mean?
My instrument's the dog, right? Like I fire up a digital audio workstation, and within a short period of time, I can compose all components to a symphony or something in a song score. So that's to me like what I play. But yeah, unfortunately, this isn't a very mobile instrument, and even as a producer, I'm not that great. If I try and take a laptop over to a buddy's house or whatever, pretty much as I've started to build the rig, this becomes my firepower and like my palette, my toolbox. It's weird to go other places. You know how that is, right?
Absolutely. And the 4-track and into the 24-track, it was nice to be able to kind of venture out and take those places, but I never had the same. Well, first of all, it's always hard because what if you break something traveling or whatever? It's just so much money. But secondly, it's the time it takes to set up and break down and move it and everything else, and the wear and tear of doing all of that on your equipment. It always deterred me. So yeah, putting it in the studio and having it set up and ready to go for the next time you want to use it, that's where I've been, pretty much where my avenue has been as well. It just seems like you have a more comfortable area of working because you've got it's your workshop. And so like you can't go into someone else's workshop and expect to know how everything flows.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. There's just like my dad taught me as a kid, he'd be like, hey, tools are kind of personal. It's like a toothbrush. You don't really share them. And, maybe some people wouldn't agree with that, but I work in the trades and I've done construction and things like that. And it's one of those things, you could go to any body shop or whatever. The first thing they say is, hey, you got to bring your own tools in, right? Nobody gets to borrow the tools. So, yeah, a tool becomes kind of personal to the way that you do things. And in the studio, depending on your production or as a musician or whatever. But studios themselves can be set up different ways. I've started to learn, especially as you start to go around. And some of them can be set up kind of like this, bedroom producer, singer, songwriter, performer, producer, designer, sound designer, etc., recordist, or they can be sort of a little bit more record specific. Like, pardon me, I did my internship at a studio downtown in Chicago, and that was ARU, and all that they did there is record voiceover for audio talent to do radio and TV ads. And so those were like, rather specific studio setups. They had the same microphone for all male performers and the same microphone for all female performers. The only thing that we adjusted in the studio was the height of the mic stand. The templates were preloaded. They came in and it was like press record, right? There's nothing creative. There's nothing unique. It's not like a musical journey where we're going to discover some new sound. It's just like we're tracking this to get this quality thing. That's, one way of doing things and one way to set up your studio. And some music studios, unfortunately, treat artists like that. Hey, you're booked an hour. We're going to record you, do your thing, done. Then there's, such a broad spectrum of different ways to kind of approach that. And all that kind of relates back to how you set your stuff up and what's important to you with technology. Again, like your workflow.
And how passionate you are about your projects, because if it's just a paycheck to you, you might not be thinking about what is specifically missing or what does this artist specifically need. You're just throwing them through the machine.
Yeah, those guys in the studio were nice men, but they were like, is it 4:30 yet? Like, let's get this mix wrapped up and head home because we're going to Wisconsin for the weekend.
They're over it already. And, that's what is kind of unfortunate about the music industry is like, it once it becomes a job, it's work. You know what I mean? And so like anything, we most of the time don't like working. We want to go and have fun. And
Yeah.
music, don't get me wrong, music can be very fun and very rewarding. But at the end of the day, if you're recording an event that you're not particularly fond of, and not able to put any creative spin on it, and you're just there basically as a robot, it could be a challenge to find meaning in that. And so yeah, I mean it is it's kind of a catch-22 because people are like, do what you love, and it's like, yeah, I love doing this, but there is something still kind of missing sometimes.
Yeah.
But I think that's
It's
getting back to what you were
uh,
saying about finding balance in the world. I think that's what it really comes down to, is that like when I dove into music hard, 2012, I pretty much, from then until the last couple years, I've been like 100% in. And then I realized I didn't have enough money or time to do all of the things that I needed to do in life. And so then it comes down to, how do I balance life? Because I would love to just be able to make music and just keep doing that all the time. But my my music experience, aside from working in the limited clubs that I've been in and whatnot, and events that I've DJ'd and whatnot, my experience in making my own music has not been very profitable, and it's been more of a money pit. So for me, it's like, okay, I have buried all this money into this, but now I need things like glasses, and I need to go to the dentist, and I need a tetanus shot, and I need these things, right? So it's like, how do I, and then, with COVID shuts everything down, you start reevaluating life, and a lot of people left professions that they didn't really like, and me, I left a profession that I loved because I needed insurance. It was like the kick in the face that, like, you need the basics in life, and you've been
yeah,
putting all those off because you've been focused so hard in music that you're not balanced anymore.
right.
And so
See that?
that's a challenge.
That's a tough one. I mean, in my own mind, I'm on the fence, or I should say, I'm of two schools of thought on it to describe that or elaborate. Basically, I believe that um, greatness is not balance. Greatness is sort of being obsessed or being crazy and not having balance whatsoever. You look at anyone who achieved something really amazing in this world, and they didn't do it because they had a nice balanced life. Look at Albert Einstein, um, that type of thing. So, but if I'm learning anything these days in life, more than anything, it's how more enjoyable and like more inspiration, and how much more energy I can derive from the world around me when I try and stay balanced and not become obsessed. To kind of take a step back, when I was in school, we had a class, and in that class, I remember the resident advisor walking in and saying, he was like kind of an off-color comment where we were talking, and he was talking to the teacher, and suddenly he just said to the class, he's like, well, it's okay to try everything, and you should be good at everything, but you should be great at least one thing. And so, in other words, do focus, do be obsessed. And then he went on to elaborate and say, that's how you're going to basically like make a niche for yourself. That's how you're going to develop a reputation. That's how you're going to build your brand, right? Like, and right away in school, just for an example, I was trying to be open-minded and come into school and say, like, okay, I do all different kinds of music. I'm not just only making electronic music, which was kind of my background. But then before the end of the semester, I had developed a reputation because everyone was like, hey, he makes electronic music. Oh, we need a sound score. Oh, we need a remix. Boom, let's go to him for that, because they didn't know what everybody else was doing yet. So it was like, be great at least one thing. Well, I was obsessed, and I had focused a lot of time and energy to learning my craft and developing that one side of my skill before I'd even taken on the idea that there was other sides to audio, and kind of tried to become balanced and learn a taste of everything. So yeah, that's my idea on it, is you should be really good at one thing, which means being obsessed and spending a lot of time in order to get good at your craft. However, you still have to take a deep breath, take a step back from the computer, go out and walk around, use your physical human body, stay healthy. I'm super focused on that now, that like holistic well-being and living gives better inspiration, and then your time in the studio is worth more when you sit down and your brain is gelling and it's doing good because your body's been fed food, versus the type of person that I am, and my background for the last 10 or 15 years of production is I've been sitting here and it's 4 in the morning and I haven't stopped to go pee or even get up to feed myself, and I've been obsessed on this loop for like, I don't know, 8 or 10 or 12 or 13 hours, and suddenly it's like, oh my god, it's about to be sunrise and I just want to finish this song. I won't stop it out at all, and that kind of thing isn't really balanced, and it usually doesn't lead to better production. You look at that track Janky, where I was pretty much obsessed with making a loop and got sucked into a track for a year, and then when it was all said and done, I was like, wasn't that catchy? Like, take a step back, listen to it, and so give yourself the 1 hour breaks, give yourself a timer, do what you got to do, but stay balanced. However,
it was pretty catchy. I mean, was it worth the hour? I mean, the year? I can't say that for you, because like with Find My Way, it took me like 6 years to make that album. And so like from inception to finally releasing. And and so it's like, I mean, that was 12 songs. That's a half a year a song basically. I mean, it's a lot of time, and and if you're making money somewhere else, like that's kind of what I'm realizing, is that my journey has been me do everything, because I can't afford to pay anybody else to do anything. So I need to learn how to do all of it so that I can get it done, because otherwise it doesn't get done. But then I find myself on the computer, building a website and spending a year building a website and being on there for 13, 18 hours a day on the computer. And then when I step away, my eyes are just horrible. And, and so like finding like, okay, I need to have more balance time, and taking on the new job that I'm at now, I barely see a screen at all, and I love it. And it gives me, when I get back to the house, it gives me more motivation to get some of my stuff done in the couple of hours that I've got, because I know I don't have a whole lot of time, but it doesn't allow me to sit there and question everything, because there isn't enough time.
Right.
And so it really puts the fire under the.
I started producing in 2004. I lived in Illinois at that point in time. From then until now, the main thing that's changed is I've learned that life is short, and it's very important to me to live life. Music's fun, and production is great, and it's even something that I engage in and make money with. But 7 years ago, I made a real strong decision in life, and I walked away from a potential career in only audio. And I decided, you know what, I'm going to follow my passion as a person. I'm going to capitalize on my prime as a young man. And so I moved away from Illinois, and I went to Colorado, to the mountains, to live at high elevation, to be underneath the open sky, and to play in the snow. And that is what I do. So like, that's a strong focus for me now. Like, you look at my studio setup, and it's like, boom, there's my window, and that thing sits there and taunts me all day long. I just look outside, and I'm like, okay, how much longer am I going to sit here and do this? I'm a guy sitting in a room playing with a computer when there's a world out there. I want to go. I see trees, I see mountains. So, but I live and I try and be healthy. My focus now for 7 years has been, if there is sunshine and if my two legs are working and I do not have a job to go to or anything else to do more pressing, I'm going to leave my house and I'm going to go outside and I'm going to do something physical with my body. And that's my most important thing. Later, when there's time and when it doesn't necessarily matter, it's easy to come home, sit down, sit in front of the studio, be at the computer, do whatever, a different vibe. And so that's caused me to like kind of shift through music and different genres and styles and so much in the last 6 or 7 years, instead of just kind of like being obsessed and hammering away at the same thing that I used to when I first started producing. So that's been interesting, and it came from that thing we were just talking about, trying to inject a little balance into my life, but also realizing that my prime focus was going to shift away from like, before it was my biggest goal in life to make tracks and sell them and put myself out there and be an audio engineer. And then I decided, okay, I like audio and I'll work with it, but I don't think it's going to be my bread and butter. Let's find a way to go do my passion, which was to be outside, and so I went to work for a ski resort.
Yeah, I mean, that balance is hard, man. It's because if you were to only follow your passion of music, certain things are going to get left in the wayside. I speak from experience.
Yeah.
But if you don't take that time to focus hard on it, for one, you're never going to know. It's always going to be this dream. Could I have done something with it? But for two, you're just never going to even. You don't know what you don't know. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, so until you get started and really dive in, it's just like a fantasy, and you don't know what the real world of music is about. And
Right.
I appreciate the ups and downs. I mean, to learn from people like yourself and Matt and everyone else that I collaborated with over the years, that to me is what I'm taking and holding more dear now that I've gotten older than even making my own music. Because it's fun doing my own stuff and being like, hey, I made this. But there's something more special about being like, hey, I made this with this guy and it's super cool.
Dude, I think anytime you can look back on a project that you're proud of, that's worth a lot. And even like what we were talking about before with spending time and building a little bit of a studio, or with music improving your life because you focused on it. I got really lucky, and there was a point in time in my 20s where I don't think I was living a very healthy lifestyle. I didn't have a great focus at the end of the tunnel or whatever. I was just trying to, get by and do things. And so I tried to, as I got into music, I would, for example, on Friday night, every Friday night, I'd be in the studio, and that kept me out from the streets. That kept me out from like what my buddies were doing, which was going hitting the bar, and then eventually drinking and driving, and everybody got their DUIs, and I didn't. And I stayed away from that scene. I built my skill every Friday night. It was like a little bit of a commitment, like going to church, and I would sit there and over the course of time develop a little pride, like, hey, I'm actually investing time into my skill, trade, and craft. And so anyway, that helped me with music, but it also improved, focus on getting work done and making music. But gradually, my friends started to want to come over, and then that became the social scene. And so it was like, oh, cool, people are coming over. My studio was also my bedroom, was also my whole basement, which had a ping pong table, dartboard, so drinking and partying was happening sometimes while music may or may not have been really getting produced. I'd get drumming circles, and that gave birth to, like the interactive studio, which is kind of like how I went from there and learned as an artist and as a person, having fun with friends. And so the course of music has also been this like social thing, and that's maybe been more fun over the course of time. And I mention it to say, you look back and what's the one thing you remember more than the songs you made that you really like? The moments you shared with tracks, with people. Like, so if you made a song with somebody else, or you had people in the studio, those are fun memories. That's like, hey, we went to the beach, we had a good time. Or, hey, me and this guitarist wrote this track, and then the drummer came in and we laid it down. People matter, right? I think relationships matter, and so as we progress and move through life, we're gonna try and cling to like the friends and the friendships that we've made, and maybe some of that is all just part of like music connections. It's kind of cool.
Yeah, and we have like it is important to invest in yourself. We've talked about that. It is also important to go out and do those fun things with your friends and family too, and have those experiences. Because like when I traveled to California for the first time, or Austin, Texas for the first time. Well, I've only been to them one time each, but my point is, when I went there, it broadened my horizons. It opened me up to new things, and it changed me forever. And experiences do that. Like, going to Morton East for summer school opened my eyes to the Cicero side of life when I was in Berwyn. Being the only guy in Dance 2 choreography in high school because I was a break dancer, like, that changed me as a person interacting around people. Like, it's just interesting, and I've been to these things called Inner Journey and Forgetting to Remember, and when I was a kid, Snowball, Snowflake, all these different, like Dare, all these different things that some people don't get in life. They don't have the opportunity to experience these things. and they shape and change you and help you grow into hopefully a better person. And and for me, I'm super thankful for that, because as I get older, I start realizing, when I start, reconnecting with some of my younger peers, people that you see them at a store or something, and you catch up, and you're like, oh, like they're not following, they don't have a passion, they don't have a goal, they don't have anything that they're doing, they're still on the same path, and that's discouraging. And it makes me wonder, why am I different? Why? And maybe it's because of these experiences that I've had. Maybe it's because of a multitude of things. But I do think that the experiences are important. So it's not like only invest in yourself and only spend your money on hardware and stuff. You do need to go do things too. But there is a level of, if you don't invest in yourself, nobody else is gonna.
Yeah, I was just reading an article today, and the guy said in there, to bear in mind at the end of the day that you are the one mechanism driving your own career, and it's like you said, that kind of becomes that you do all parts to figure out how to get it out there, from writing and production to mixing and essentially mastering, and then distribution and media and marketing. And sometimes these days you try it all out, and depending if you're good at it, you do it all, or maybe you learn that, hey, that's not my thing, or somebody else is better at it, let's get it over to him. And you're lucky if you meet people along the way who can help you on that path. But yeah, it's important to know that, and then kind of take that into consideration, which is maybe a good thing in life, no matter what you're focused on. If you're a sports athlete, you've got to work out. If you're a music producer, you've got to develop your craft, right? And take on.
So let's go backwards a little bit. We met, like I said, through Matt. So we did this like weird, just jam session. It was like how you're saying, drum circles, all that stuff. Like back in that time, it was not uncommon for me to meet new people and just start jamming in jam sessions. Just play whatever is about. Like, oh, you got a drum? Let me play the drum. Yeah. And so we make this little, like, well, really, it's not even we're just having a jam session, and I really like the sound of this guitar playing through your live wire setup or whatever. And I'm like, I need to record this sound. There's something about this sound. I really like this guitar. And then all of a sudden, all of us start, like, making something. And so it went from me just trying to capture this, like, guitar sound to this cool, like, weird freestyle jam session. And, I throw it up on SoundCloud a few years later just because I thought it was fun. And that kind of is the birth of our friendship. We've met the one time in person. And so from then, we've collaborated on at least 7 tracks, and a couple more in the making that I haven't quite finished. And it's really amazing that you can develop a friendship from just a jam session and a common interest.
Yeah, definitely the common interest. I'd love to hear that track again, because I've certainly forgot it, and I'm glad you brought up the specifics surrounding that particular experience, only because my own memory of that night wasn't sharp, and ever since you and I have been connected, I've always kind of had a fuzzy gray haze in my mind about how exactly did we meet. I know it was something like back when I had the 109 Towncrest studio, blah blah blah, but yeah, that was it. And I know, or I remember, that there were a lot of different options when you took a live instrument into that studio, as far as how it could be set up and configured to kind of create amps and things that weren't, live amps. But yeah, fun stuff. And pardon me, better still that it was a good social moment that, was how we met and launched us into other tracks. I know that year I was going to school for sound, and those were 2 years where I was supposed to be dedicated very much to learning. And so it was about a 50 or a 60-hour work week at school, plus my, how do you call that, travel to and from on the train. So that was another 2 hours or 4 hours a day. So it was like really full days. And I say that because I didn't have, I pretty much told myself, you don't have time to come home and make music or write songs. Like, focus on school, get schoolwork done. But for these 2 years that you're at school, or however long it was, 2.5 years, don't be focused also on like personal production. And it's funny because I said that and then ended up like, you know, squeezing out a decent amount of work on my own. But that time was definitely a heady period of like collaborating, mixing and matching, meeting people, bringing people over, working with other artists, songs, samples, recording. I was just like taking it all in and loving it all. And you know, Chicago, what a place, right? There's a pretty good scene anywhere you're at. I was lucky enough to be downtown, dealing with like professional bands in you know some of the best studios that Chicago has, which are world renowned, as well as being out on the South Side where I lived, and was also like surrounded with all the live jam band scenes and the pub crawlers and blah blah blah. So you know, kind of you know getting a taste, and it was good. And that's cool. That's how we got started.
Yeah, I mean, Chicago is definitely an interesting scene. It seems like it's very challenging for people to break through from Chicago without leaving, but it does cultivate a very strong growth. I do believe that. I've seen a lot of people become very good just by going to open mics and you know getting a few shows that they can find around the city and things like that.
Well, if competition's high, then it is going to foster like a high level of performance too. So what I've heard other performers say is, "Oh, Chicago, you know, that's where those really good studio musicians are." And yeah, like look at the back in the '80s and the '90s, there was all these band competitions and things like that, and big bands would have to come out and beat all the other ones. And Chicago is pretty renowned as being a sharp place for rock and the birth of a lot of different. You know, not just the birth, but obviously like fostering strong source of music. So it's around, and it's cool to kind of rub shoulders with some of the more professional things, and you know, see what was the potential of it, bring you up a little bit.
So we just you. So where do I start with this? I made a song with a producer. Well, let's go even further back because this story kind of just keeps getting more entangled. So. A producer, I'm not sure how. See, when you say it's fuzzy how we met, with this other producer, I've never actually met this guy, so it's a little more fuzzy on to how we even connected. If I had to guess, it's one of two ways. Either I found him by looking up peace stuff, or he found me because I'm so in the PeaceSum world, right? But basically, I stumbled across this song, "We Want Peace." And I loved it. And I was like, you know what? I can do something with this. And it wasn't really my forte. It wasn't really where I thought my music was going. But it was like somebody else produced this and it seems to fit what I'm doing. And so I reached out and I was like, hey, what are you doing with this? Can I use it? And then after some negotiation, I ended up buying the exclusive from it. And he sent me the stems, everything to it. And so I record something. I have... Kyle McComb master it. He's a guy, DJ Nightfighter was his name back in the day. We did a collaboration called The River. So he masters it. He sends it back, and I release it online and everything, and it sits there for 5 years until you finish a track. So it obviously a little earlier, probably about 4 years it sits there, and then I send you over stems from Find My Way and from We Want Peace. And I'm like, hey, you want to do a remix? Because we've already been working together and done some different collabs where you've sent me stuff. So I'm like, all right, I'm going to send him something and see if he can remake something. So then you make We Want Peace, the dance remake, right? And that just got released last week. This podcast won't come out for probably another week or two. So it might be a few weeks by the time people are seeing this. So you do the remake of it, and so now we have this totally different version where it's dance. It's you use, I assume, most of the samples and rearrange them and configured them in your own way. And then I took that and I liked it. And I was like, I want to do a third verse. So then we add the third verse, and then I'm like, well, what if we took the third verse out and we sent this to other artists? And so now I've got a couple other artists that I've sent it to who may do even further remixes on the remake. But now we're kind of getting ahead. So let's take one little step back. You make this dance remake. What do you have to say about it? Like, what was your experience with this process?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for asking. It was really fun. I'm going to be honest with you. I have kind of been in a different zone as an artist for a while, but it took me back to like 2010 to 2013 when I was just cranking out tracks, and it was in my best interest to get my hands on any hot track and do a remix for it. So that was really common to me to do remixes and to make tracks from scratch. I got your track. It took me a little bit of time because I had like 4 projects on my plate that week or that month or whatever, and then finally sat down and put it on the plate and was like, okay, let's take a look at this. Let's see what what kind of style we're going to do. And what's funny is I definitely had a particular style in my mind. I was like, okay, listening to this track, here is the sound that it has, right? And the sound was rather specific. So I looked at it and was like, maybe let's change it and make it different. And I think that's my nature when it comes to a remix, is like, if it's already been good and somebody else made it, then I have to do something at least as good as theirs or better, or else there's no point in making a remix, right? A good song is already there. I mean, the remix can sometimes serve to sort of bring new energy to the old song. But anyway, I look at it as like, yeah, my remix should be something unique and creative, but also complement the original track. So I got a hold of your song. I think in my mind, I had this reggae dub thing that I was thinking about. I was like, yeah, I'm going to like reggae it and make it, because it was like a standard kind of hip-hop song, but it also had a little bit of like 90s flavor in a sense that it was kind of produced with a lot of different sounds and had a wide floor, maybe even like a little bit of rock in there. So anyway, got a hold of the track, put it into the system, and was surprised that as I started putting like the elements and just building the track from the ground up, it started to just like take on this sound of like a bit of electro. And I was like, okay, I kind of like that. Let's just go with that. So I stripped out the elements and cut things away until there was kind of a blank space with a lot of space in the mix. And kind of the other song had been busy. There was a lot going on. And so I stripped it down and just went to a very basic, I don't know, 2013 kind of electro sound as far as I was concerned. Real standard, chromatic on the bass, just a couple note changes. And so anyway, built that framework. Kind of liked the vibe. I got into one of those things where I was like digging the loop, and then I worked with it. And I honestly think I sat here and produced that whole track in like 3 hours. And then surprised myself with that remix that it was so fluid that I didn't really pull a lot of other sounds and put a bunch of stuff in there. I was like, no, the song sounds good the way it is. Let's put a couple sounds in there that we like and then leave it alone. And so I did that, and then sent it back over to you to see what you thought. And by then I kind of already liked the vibe, and so anything else we did after the fact was just kind of tweaking that. When I look back in the session, and we went back into that session so many times to export out different versions of the song, it wasn't a very clean session. In other words, I was just working fast and hasty, which usually means I'm pretty inspired and I'm just throwing things in and going with it. So I think it was a fun remix, maybe one of the most fun I've done. I was actually satisfied with the result, which never happens. And at the time that I did that remix, I thought, well, this will be one avenue, and then I'll do 2 or 3 other versions, different styles. Ended up just making that one and kind of moving on with other projects I had, and was like, no, it's cool. It's its own sound. And it wasn't until I had a friend come over and I played for her the original and then played the remix, that's when I kind of realized how different the take on it I had made was. But
yeah, I mean, it's night and day. It really is.
It's fun. It's vibey,
Yeah. So that was a lot of fun to see something that I already made come back in a real life. I mean, that's it's a first for me. Like I've done remixes and things, but I've never just sent something to someone and been like, do something with it. Let's see what happens. And I was really impressed with what came back. It was really fun, and so much so that I was like, I got to put another verse on this. And that verse took me longer than it took you to record the thing.
I mean, the small stuff takes forever, man. You'll go back and do edits and tweaks for 3 days on a track you wrote in an hour.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. So that's We Want Peace. So in the end of this, I'll probably release the remix to the remake. That'll have my third verse in it. And
Nice.
then we've also got Tokyo Horizon, which is a beat that you produced that you sent over, and it's a little snippet. It's not a long song. It's maybe a minute and a half or something like that. I really liked the vibe of it, and it gave me this like it felt like there's this swag that I've been kind of looking for in how I pronounce the end of my words, or how I pronounce the end of my lines. And I really enjoyed that, the feel, the vibe to that. So tell me a little bit about Tokyo Horizon.
Yeah, that was a fun one. I am always finding new sources of inspiration as an artist, and so I guess it would have been 2019. I came across a set on SoundCloud that was mixed by a guy who was a bit of an archivist, and he had all this Japanese disco and synth pop and R&B specifically from the 80s. And so it was like 1981 or 82 or 83 to 87, 89, real specific stuff. Anyway, it was like an hour-long mix set or whatever, and I couldn't believe how unique it was. I got so into that, I was like, man, what is all this stuff? And more importantly, as a producer, I've always had quite an affinity for disco. I won't get long-winded on that, but suffice it to say, I'm always sourcing disco and trying to find sample loops and playable parts to make tracks on and stuff like that. So I saw it as a huge hour-long sample track. I was like, man, there's all this stuff in here. It's all different. It's so unique. Bottom line, I came across a track in that set. I came across a bunch, and I sampled them all out. In fact, I've built sample packs from that set, and also having downloaded a bunch of the original tracks. But one track in specific was called Woody and Diane by somebody or other, Noriko Mosima or something. I forget her first name, Japanese artist. And that track is Tokyo Horizon. So the track was slowed down and played a little bit slower and deeper in the original. I don't remember the tempo, something below 100 BPM. And then I kept trying to time stretch it, and I found that at 110 BPM it played decently. So I think originally I had sped it up to 120 and then re-stretched it back down to 110 to give me time to fit my beat in. So pretty much just took like the first 15 seconds of that track, which is very, very Japanese and very 80s or 70s. It's got this real vibe tone that was kind of like worldy, but sort of oriental and also synthesizers. So threw that down, found the key that it was in, put some beats behind it, made a loop out of it, and wrote a little snippet. This was during COVID lockdown, and that was the time that I was incredibly prolific. I had a few friends come over, and we were making tracks together, but mainly I was producing a lot of tracks from scratch, specifically as like scratch tracks, loop tracks. These are like songs that are all 80% done. I would specifically leave parts out of them, or mute parts, like I could write the bass line, but let's leave it alone. Maybe my bassist friend wants to make a sick bass part for it, or I'd write synth part loops and leave drum tracks out. Maybe my drummer friend wants to play along. So I've made all these, and it actually spawned a whole separate SoundCloud thing that I do called Joe's Demo Loops, where anytime that the track, it's a great outlet, right? Sometimes you got a track and you're not sure what to do with it. You're like, well, this part's good. Let's export a drum track or whatever. So I've got that going that started. But anyway, I started a bunch of songs, a lot of projects, something like 20 demo projects came out, and one of which was Tokyo Horizons. I don't remember when I was coming back across all that work, but I do remember listening to it at some point, probably getting drunk and listening to music or whatever. And I thought to myself, that's got like a rap or a hip-hop-esque kind of beat. I was like, I should send that to Pete Alice, or I should send that to anyone who wants to rap on top of it, was my thoughts, and you were the first person that came to mind. So I sent it over, and just kind of went we were done with all the other current projects, here's one of these things if you ever get time and you want to throw a verse on it, So that is Tokyo Horizon, and then essentially, fast forward, you got around to making some parts on it, shot it back, and we had a couple back and forths on its production, trying to get the right feel to it. I think we're satisfied with the final result.
Yeah, it's interesting sending stuff back and forth like that too, because I'm not sure what was going on if our different DAWs start off of at a different 0 point, like microseconds apart from each other. Like mine didn't seem to have a delay that yours did, and I'm not sure why that was, because the 0 point should have been the same on both.
What that came from, what it comes down to is start time or start point, and so in your session, typically speaking, you'll have a start time at 0 mark, and all your stuff lines up from there. But when it comes time to actually export a whole song, you can't have everything start at 0 mark because the audio software requires a latency of some millisecond time to actually engage into its recording export. And if you do that, what happens is the second I press play, the song already starts. There's no introduction or lead time. So typically speaking, how I was taught in school is that you always take the track and shuffle the whole thing over slightly from the start point to give yourself a lead time on your export file. That's done when you're at your final stage. When you're working back and forth, it would confuse someone to do that. And I think that I made the mistake of unfortunately doing that during one of the exports. Then that introduced probably about a 0.75 of 1 second or a 3/4
I
second
knew it was really small.
introduction into the start time, so that when we were drag and dropping the files, they weren't starting off the same start point as the original file I'd sent you. So that's my fault, but that's how that happened, and that's why it happened.
And that's interesting because, see, like I've not been traditionally taught in any sense of the word. I've learned everything from friends, from YouTube, from personal experience, and
Yeah.
and so the lead in time, I've never done that. So that's interesting. I have done it like with albums. I'll give the lead time when I've got the whole track and now I'm putting it into an album and I'm building it. The timescape of it, I'm like, okay, well, it's going to need a couple seconds here, and I'll do that usually with CD Architect, and then export that whole thing. That way, I know exactly how many seconds on the end of everything, and I can listen to the whole thing, and it sounds like an actual album. But I've never done that in the production phase or the exporting phase or any of that. So that's an interesting. I guess I'm always thinking about all that stuff later when it comes time to doing that, but I haven't had as much back and forth with other producers where you would need that. So that it's interesting to know that people do that.
Yeah, that's just something I learned right there at school. They said, hey, here's how to do it. Good thing, too, because from a DAW, if you just start at your drop point, that's what you get is the song like starting right away. And what happens there is you actually lose the transient. So let's say you've got compressors and limiters and things like that configured to start. If they're supposed to start and the computer tells them to start and there's audio being fed into it and then somebody else is like exporting or recording the audio out, and it all happens in 1 millisecond of computer time, it's not really enough time to respond, and what you'll actually get in the audio output is this huge drop in your amplitude burst because it's supposed to start at that same time and the computer probably just can't process that. I don't know, maybe some softwares are better than others, but
I was gonna say with like a patch, wouldn't it just automatically be on?
So there's different ways you can record or export out, and at the end of the day, you might get away with not having that problem that I've just described, and you can have your song start at the drop point, but you would still want to arrange it out and slide it away slightly from the start point, or else whenever someone presses play on your song, it starts immediately. Like there's no lead time in or out of your song. So the next song is going to end. Let's say you listen to iTunes Shuffle or whatever. Next song fades out, and then instantly your song starts. Like no lead time.
Oh, so what I think I've done in the past when I'm recording, I think that I just give it that second before I start. So it's not technically that I've moved the track over. The track still starts at 0, but when the first beat starts, will be like a second later. So there is like a second usually before the beat will start on my own personal recordings.
Okay.
Is that sufficient, or is that still gonna cut off your effects?
I would have to look at it specifically to see if it's actually exporting from a start point that's the same as the downbeat.
So you're saying like
So
if the track is at 0, like that's when the audio file begins. Your compressors, your whatever you've got on, are trying to start at the same time it's playing, so they don't actually kick in. But if you've moved that track past your start point and you put that on to that, then it has that second to start the recording, and then as the track is actually starting, all your compressors and everything else kick in with that track.
That's my understand. Yeah, that's my understanding of it, and it's rather specifically because of the fact that in audio land, in computer land, you're dealing in like when it powers on and when it sends, digital signal. And so obviously some compression is not that powerful, but like I've had compressors that are incredibly like you said, them really really high, so they're slamming, and they need a chance to activate before the loop starts, or else you get like a pop out of it when they actually engage, which is like obviously the worst case scenario. But just from a standard standpoint, yeah, the introduction of a little bit of space before the track is nice. And then my thought process is that if you don't do that, if you literally start your export or hit render at the same time as your downbeat, it's a pretty strong chance that your computer may run into some processing scenario which would result in your loss of the amplitude of the first note or the first burst, even if it's just minimal.
I've seen that, like We Want Peace, it starts off and it's almost not having the we,
Yeah.
the W and the we.
Yeah, or try it, dude. Take a kick loop. This is a great way to test it. Take a kick loop, 4 bars or 8 bars. Put a strong compressor on that kick so that you have a pretty strong response on it, and then hit record or hit export and do it 2 or 3 different ways and drag the audio loop back in. If the first kick out of 8 kicks is smaller than the other 7, you know that that's exactly what I'm talking about. And if it's not, all 8 kicks are identical in size, then you know it shouldn't affect your actual export. You can kind of test that out.
What I do when I'm putting all my compressors on, and I know this isn't the way to do it, but for whatever reason, this is the way that I've always done it. I'll save my file. Like this is done being edited and moved into position, and all my breaths are cut out, and this is what I want, right? So this is saved. Now I put a 1 or whatever I want, another version, and then now I start editing with my compression. And I know that it's not ideal because if you mess up, you can't go back. But I put it directly on the track. You know, does that make sense? Like
Yeah.
instead of using it as a patch, I'll put it directly on the track. So there is no kicking on. The track already has it.
Okay.
You know, does that make sense? So I think that's why I haven't ran into that problem. I think because I'm not using them
it could be rather specific to the amount of digital signal processing your computer is doing, and or how much processing power your computer has. I'm a little bit of a junkie in that department. I'm trying to be better about it, but I'm typically that's my area of expertise was kind of mangling and wrangling sound, making different sound through the process of digital signal processing. So a lot of times I'm using tons of different plugins and stuff within the workspace there, and maybe that stuff tends to max out the computer's potential. You know what I mean? And that's where I'm getting that latency from when I go to export it. But even in my DAW of choice, there's a few different ways to export. And what I was going to say previously is then the way that I was trained at school was, even as an electronic music artist, you shouldn't simply be exporting your files and expect that that's the best audio quality of output that you can get. So I was trained a whole different way, which is that these are all simply instruments. And at the end of the day, the way to record an instrument is still going to be to come out of the computer and back into a source, whether that's a tape or whether that's another computer, which is how most studios run. That's how you record. So what we would actually do is record all of that stuff back out, and sometimes, check this out, let's say me and 3 guys come in with a whole barrage of synthesizers and drum machines and blah, 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 and we actually record it all into a studio, proper professional studio. That studio takes all the sound and they put it onto a huge console. Let's say we're working with an SSL 4000. Beautiful sound. We compress it all through the SSL. We're using outboard processing to get really much more sound and timbre into all these different tracks that are coming out of our electronic computers. Then, even after all of that, we come back out of the SSL board, we would record back into Pro Tools on a separate, dedicated computer that floated, just sat in the studio for the only purpose of being an electronic tape recording machine. Now Pro Tools serves as nothing more than a recording device, so you can do that individually, you can do it all at once, however your style of performance is. That's basically the top level in my mind of like output production. Yes, it's okay to export everything from your software, especially as an electronic music producer, and then take that 2-file track back out, but you should be doing something with it. Don't ever try and master it. Sorry.
Can you bus it?
Sorry.
Can you bus? Is that the same thing? In Pro Tools now, like you have the option of like routing everything to a different bus, and then you're recording all of those tracks into.
I think my understanding of the word bus simply just means the signal routing or routing of the way that signal chain goes. So you can have multiple sources all going onto a single bus, and you can control audio in that way. But that doesn't change the fact that when you are all done with it, if you're using a digital audio workstation, you hit export. That digital audio workstation has to communicate using the hardware of your computer to export your audio from the files back out into an audio file. It's done through analog to digital and a digital to analog converter, and that's all done through your interface or your PCI EX bus if you have a really good sound card or whatever that may be. When that happens, it goes through and uses all your time coding and exports it back out, and you get the result file into what's called a two-track stereo. And that's your main output, right? It's a left and a right. That's your whole export. You then need to take that track and do something with it. That's typically how mastering works, is you send your 2-track off to somebody else. That's one way to do it. Another really great way to do it is export your file as stems from your production session. FL Studio that I use has an option I can actually just do that. It's called split mixer tracks. So it exports every single mixer track uniquely. Then I can take 17 tracks, drag them into Pro Tools, and mix the track like a professional, or in other words, do a better editing job or a better mixing job in a software that at that moment is only dedicated for the purpose of mixing your track down. It doesn't have to be Pro Tools. You could use Logic. You could bring it right back into whatever you use comfortably.
So you're taking all your effect. You're basically saying that the effects are dumbing down the recording because you're using all the processing of all that to run the effects.
Well, I'm just describing a method by which if you take your sound after it's been exported as a 2-track audio and bring it back into a second session, you can really build your quality further and basically master. And that would be the stage of mastering, the stage of like final mixdowns. And you can introduce different stuff in that stage, but I typically will do that if there's a purpose to get the song sounding clean and properly mixed. For example, sometimes I make tracks and there's too much going on in the session and it's costing the computer all kinds of digital signal processing to process all this stuff. I don't want to try and render all that out and hope that that's my best quality, because you get what's known as bottlenecking. Pretty much in the digital land, once you've got more than 16 tracks and you're exporting, all this stuff is ones and zeros and it's got to come back out, and doesn't translate all so well, man. I can tell you from having been on like $100,000 to $300,000 sound systems in professional studios that you do run into issues with audio software and translated hardware. And so that's one way to get around it. If you've got a whole bunch of stuff in a session, export them all out as stems, remix it into your next session.
From one Pro Tools session of all of your stuff into another empty Pro Tools session, and now you've got a 2-track of that whole thing.
Yeah, let's say you just have 17 audio tracks. You don't have to do anything to them. They already sound how they already sound. All you got to do is just sit there and engineer your mix level and compress that out and then master it. Done. Versus going in there and adding extra stuff when every channel's maxed out with all these processors on it.
So I think on my 24, I'm only capable of sending out 2 tracks at a time.
Yeah, I don't know that the recorder would work the same way a digital audio workstation would work, but let's say that you finish whatever your track project is. Just consider the next time you do that and you have a 2-track audio, take it to the next stage, which is before you even send it off to the mastering engineer, drag it back into the next session and toy around with some EQ and some compression and multiband compression.
Oh, it doesn't even have to be another computer. You're just saying... No, well, it does, though, because you're recording... You're taking it from the output of the computer you've edited everything on, and then you're sending that into an interface on another computer to record it in live, like an instrument, right?
Well, that's how it was done in the studio when you can afford multiple systems. What I'm talking about is at home. when you've exported, you're now looking at a WAV file, right? There's your two channel stereo, or what they just call a 2-track. Drag that 2-track out into your DAW of choice and throw a few effects on it, toy around with that, and that's pretty much your pre mix down mastering stage, where you're not even really mastering it, you're just looking at what's the potential here for my mix down in a cleaner session. That can be one option to kind of improve sound, and it helps out if you're dealing in a dirty mix and you want to, remix your own mix a little bit.
So what are you going to be doing in that 2 session? Like or a 2-track session? What kind of?
Well, yeah, that's maybe the low end of the spectrum, but if I were doing it that way, I would just drag it out, and then I would be looking at that from EQ, mainly just kind of like what's my frequency bands, like how can I improve that? Is anything loud or not loud enough? Is it normalized? Kind of the levels are good throughout the track. If not, can I add some compression or gating to increase that type of stuff?
So what's the difference between doing that in your DAW on one computer versus sending it out to another interface to another computer? Is there a difference in quality?
Well, let me take a step back. I think I've confused you by having given you the description of how it was done in the studio, where we actually ran stuff from the audio output live through a soundboard, and from the soundboard live back into a computer live, and recorded it all in the same time, and/or had that all happening while a performance was going on. So if a drummer was drumming and the guitarist was guitaring and a vocalist was singing, all of that was going through everything that they were using, microphones, into the live SSL 4000 board, and from the outboard processing gear back through the computer, or back into the board, and from the board to a computer that ran Pro Tools that was recording live.
A 2-track from the board to an interface onto another DAW.
Yep. I don't even know what the interface was. Well, the interface was the HDIO or the HD192 for Pro Tools. So then that interface ran back to Pro Tools that ran on a separate gig. That's one way to get like an enhanced sound if you're using electronic equipment, is to take it from your stage and don't just run it into a computer, run it through the computer or run it through processing. So that's what I was talking about. If you're not doing that though, then just going back to like when it comes time and you're the artist and you're mixing and mastering yourself, when you go to export your track, there are ways to improve your sound quality and kind of get into a multi-stage process to basically master your own track or get your track to the best stage possible, and clean it up a little bit. I say this mainly because I'm a person who makes tracks with a lot of parts in them, and they can become pretty dirty, and an easy way to clean stuff up is to do this process I'm talking about, is exporting and cleaning stuff up as you do that. If you work really clean and you don't use a whole lot of digital signal processing, maybe you don't need to do that. Maybe your session is nice and clean, and you can put a few compressors.
Or if you've got enough processing power in your rig, then maybe you don't.
But at the end of the day, let me make this clear. As I have learned from every professional I've ever come across and or read, you should never attempt to process mastering stage through your mixdown. In other words, you've written a track, and now you're going to hit export or render or bounce, whatever your file is called. You don't go and put a bunch of mixing and mastering plugins on your master channel and say, hey guys, it's done, we slammed it and it sounds great. Nope, you don't do that. You get your mix as good, as best as you possibly can in the mix, in your mixdown, and then you take that and you export it, and now you have a .wav or whatever to work in. You take that and you drag it into a new session with nothing else in it, and you work on that file. That's mixing and mastering. That's how you get it to the next stage, and that's where you put your stuff on it. That's where you put your extra EQ. That's where you put your multiband compression, whatever stereo enhancements you want to work.
So you're not putting EQ on before?
Sure, I put EQ. I put all kind of compression on before, but I don't put.
You're doing it again afterwards on the whole.
I don't put limiting. I don't put limiting on the master. I try and get all my channels as hot as I can get them, but I don't want them to clip, and I won't put any limiting on my master. I'll occasionally use a submaster, and I can talk about that more in detail, but that's my own mixing configuration, is I use a submaster with all my buses. so that if I need to do any compression or if I need to do any filtration or automations on a submaster that affects everything, it's still not on the master channel. Master channel should be pristine with nothing on it. You're basically, this is your holy mixer. It should be freaking even, no EQ, no compressor. Do anything you need to do in all of your signal chain and in your buses, and then export it and then do stuff after. That's my personal on it. There are other ways.
So you can export them as double stereo tracks, like for instance, We Want Peace. I sent you out just my vocal stems, but combined, they've already had all the stuff that I did to them, right? So they're all just a 2-track wave.
So,
but you still have your instrumental.
On that one,
correct. I did not use your 2-track balance. That was more of a reference for me, like, hey, here's their finished product. What I did was I took all of your stems, whatever there were, 17 different files, dragged them into the session. They all have the same start point. Now I have your whole original track, and I can go through, change the tempo of the folder, of the main session, chop stuff up, keep stuff where I want it, and every single one of them got assigned to its own channel. And even though you've already done all your mixing and your processing on them, maybe there's stuff I want to change. Maybe I want to EQ one of them differently. Maybe I have a totally different design for another one. So of course I'm changing stuff radically right in the mix. And that's what I did. Was there was like probably 8 tracks in there. I didn't use it all. I was like, this bass line, nope, don't need it. Okay, this other mid synth, no, I don't like that, doesn't go with this song. Cut it out. Okay, these parts work, but only here, so then just slice them and leave them to live right there. And then this other stuff, a lot of EQing, processing, changing the way it sounds. So like in the mix, making all those decisions to kind of shape your sound.
But you're talking previous to sending it back to me for the verse, right? So
right.
So
that's in the session.
What I'm saying is you've already given me this 2-track of the instrumental, the remake, right? And then I give you a verse to add in there, and you wanna make that fit well with your instrumental you've already made, right? And you want to take out the ad libs so that we don't have ad libs fighting with the new verse and that. You're taking these 2 stereo tracks, the vocals that I sent you, that third verse, and the instrumental that you sent me of the whole track, right? And you're then taking them and putting them together to master, or you're what you're doing is you're using that bass track and you're sending my vocals into your mix that has all that stuff, and then you're exporting that as a stereo, and then you're mastering from there, correct?
Yes, that's correct. The way that I did it was I set up a track that I built. That was my remix track, right? When you sent me extra parts, all I had to do was drag and drop them into that session. So you sent me verse 3, and once I got the correct timing, I just dragged it into that session and re-exported a mix down from the original session with verse 3 or with whatever part I needed, like an instrumental verse or whatever. I could mute and change different parts. Then I built a mastering template, and so I took a exported version, which was probably like version 1 back then, and went through and mixed and mastered that version how I liked, so that when it was all said and done, I was properly satisfied with each of the levels on it. Then each time changes happened, I didn't need to change anything in the mastering session. I simply needed to drag the new changed file into the other one, and it would just auto replace the file, and then I could export it with whatever changes were made, and the mastered version would come out after the fact. But they were 2 separate sessions, right? One is the remix session or the remake session where I'm actually doing the track build, and then the second one is like a mix mastering session.
Of just the 2-track at that point, not of the 4 tracks, not of the instrumental and the vocals. You've
right, just the 2-track. No, all the other stuff happens in the remix session. And then once it's the mastering time, I usually just have a 2-track. But I have to be honest with you, there's times that I break that rule. I'm like in the mastering session, and suddenly I start reintroducing all extra stuff, and it becomes a second session. Case in point, Janky. That would happen time and time again. I think I went through like 3 or 4 session builds. I'd max out a whole session and then migrate those as audio files to the next session and then process them all and then start a whole other thing and max out. Like pretty much for me, maxing it out was not 100 channels. I could go more than that, but it was as much as the computer could handle, which was at that time probably like, 1,400 megabytes of RAM, real-time RAM, and then the computer would just start to bog down so bad I couldn't hear anything play. So yeah, you gotta be careful of that pitfall.
What's funny about Get Janky is so that was the first time I think that I used the MPX 16 to do the Get Janky, to the stutter effect, and that took a lot of tracks too. I mean, people don't realize like how many vocal tracks that I lay down to get some of the songs that I get. You know what I mean? Like it's just so much. Like I was saying, I think to you before when we talked about doing the podcast, when we were talking about it, with Find My Way, there was some sessions that had literally 100 tracks in them. I mean, it was just obnoxious how much was going on in them.
That's a tough act to balance. I mean, I don't care what kind of engineer you are. That's a tough one. I can remember being at a mixing class, which was at CRC, Chicago Recording Company, downtown Chicago. They're kind of the premier recording place. And this guy says, "Okay, class, we're going to do some creative listening today," or whatever it was. And he plays for us this piece by David Foster, Carol of the Bells. It's like bone-chillingly amazing. It's, you can't hardly describe how, but you're able to audibly distinguish every instrument, and the spectrum sends chills up your spine, right? You're just like standing there. But he tells us that this mix artist, Umberto Gattaca, apparently was mixing over 90 channels of music when they recorded this, right? You've got every different aspect of the symphony playing, and each of it was being recorded separately. And I had to stop and think about that from the standpoint of a mixing engineer, and I was like really blown away at the time. Like, what? 90 channels of like, okay, I had done that before, but it was like I was, here's a hi-hat, here's a clap, here's a kick drum, here's a synthesizer line.
But you're talking 90 of live channels.
Right, each one's a group. Like, here's the violins, here's the trombones, here's the
all at once.
All onto a mix board for this session, and it was amazing because it sounds so damn good. But I say, you got to pick your battles. Like, I look at that now, 10 years later or whatever, and I'm just like, man, I don't want no part of that. Like, I fantasize about tracks that could be mixed down to 4 channels. Like, hey, wouldn't that be nice? Drums, bass, synthesizers, vocals, done. Hey, the Beatles
get overwhelmed by the amount of work.
It's like, man. So the Beatles did it. Those guys had a 4-track, which was twice more than anybody else had. It was blowing minds in its day. And guess what? They didn't even use all 4 tracks. They would like use drums and guitars onto one, and then vocals onto another, and you leave the whole other track for them to either like record extra parts, throw extra tambourines, make weird sound effects, or record sound parts back into, or like compress layer. Like, yeah, that's where was it George Harrison?
And now, see, that's another thing that we were talking about is the paralysis of over choice with the new.
Oh yeah, limit yourself right off the bat.
You just have too many options.
Yeah.
So how do you stay balanced in that regard of like you have all of these different tools at your fingertips? How are you picking and choosing the right ones and deciding what goes into what tracks?
Dude, for me, personally, this has been like, 17-year battle. Ever since I started, this is something I think about and work with. It comes down to this. I can remember a conversation in high school where we talked about what is art. And everyone has their own idea. And then the conversation really didn't have a conclusion, but my personal conclusion was art is purpose. It's having a design. It's deciding that you are going to do the following and then achieving it through whatever means necessary. So, when I first made music, I got lost in electronica land. I would get in there and I would just, oh, this sounds cool. This sounds cool. Oh, let's do this. Blah, blah, blah. That's cool. And it's important to put yourself in a place where you could have a happy accident and maybe introduce stuff you hadn't planned on. However, what I have personally learned is it is very important to have a vision in your mind and to think about what you want to make before you even sit down and start. Once you have that vision, it's easy. You're just chiseling away to try and find what sound works to make that sound that you have in your head play. And the longer you do this, the more you do this, the better you get at it. But for me, that's my essential component. And I am dogged, like a dog with a bone. When I have some certain sound that I really want, like, man, I can't be satisfied until I like stumble right upon it or until I create it through force. So like I will make that happen. But that's my go-to. That's how I avoid the endless amount of options and arrays that you have out there. And also, more specifically, in the last few years, I've really started focusing on selecting specific inspirations. So whether that's hardware that you use to help your workflow, or in my case, I try not to download a lot of extra sample packs that I don't need because it just adds too much clutter to your computer. I think it's better to have a select amount of sample packs that you know really, really well, or build your own, where you're like, I have 100 snares, and they are really great snares, and I don't need 1,000 from all these other kits, that type of thing. So, but mostly, know your tools. I can remember always wanting to get better and would read this and think, oh, I need this, oh, I need that. And then some guys would say, actually, you don't need much, but what you need is to learn your tool and learn it very well. So if all I have is 2 synthesizers and 1 drum pack, hopefully I know it so well that every time I sit down, I know exactly which drums to go to and how to make them sound good. I know how to make my synthesizer work. That's worth a whole lot more than the guy who has 31 synths, doesn't know how to use any of them, flips through preset patches, has gobs of samples, and sounds like everybody else out there because he's not doing anything unique to make it sound different. So my go-to tips are limit yourself by learning from the small stuff, and also don't be afraid to twist knobs and twiddle things, and learn by doing. Also, I hate to say it, but like reading instruction manuals, fantastically useful stuff. And in the early days, I started out teaching myself as much as I could, and then I started learning from YouTube. And it was the early days of YouTube, like circa 2007. There was actually some good stuff out there. I'm going to go ahead and say this very specifically. If you remember nothing else from this podcast, remember Joe Mccarty saying, YouTube is not your friend. It's not where you learn. It's probably not where you come away with good ideas from. Most of the guys out there these days are not your best teacher. They're telling you how to do stuff, and I think it's pretty much wrong. I was lucky enough to go to school where there's still some sense of science behind it. And one thing that I hated so much, but here's the reality, there aren't facts. It's all suggestive and relevant to what you're going after. So I used to always ask, well, what's the right answer? And they'd be like, well, depends what you're after. But I can tell you this, there's a lot of guys out there on YouTube who are like, I do this, and this is how I do it, and blah, blah, blah. That's not maybe the best way to do it. So try and learn the best way. Try and learn from the guys who are like, maybe sound designers and professionals. I don't want to say there's nothing good out there. There definitely is. But I mentioned to say, in my time, when I first started out, there was some good teachers out there, and I learned some stuff from them. But it was only a short period of time later where I was like, oh boy, these guys are all teaching you all the wrong things and telling you how to crank this up and crank that up. And so maybe, watch out for that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, because it can be challenging. You're trying to learn something new, and you see something that kind of works for somebody else, so you're like, oh, I'll try that. And that can become a part of your toolkit, and years later you realize, oh, that tool is dull and doesn't work well.
Yeah, ultimately all I'm talking about is kind of building your toolkit, right? Like making your firepower work for you, whatever the environment is. But you mentioned a good point about limiting yourself, and I've read a lot in the early days. How I got started in developing myself was very awesome. My younger brother went to Barnes & Noble and came home with a magazine of Computer Music Magazine. I could go pull it off the shelf for you. It's episode 114. It was called How to Make Your Hip Hop Bass Better and Bigger. And he brought it home, gave it to me, and was like, check out what I found for you. And I was like, oh, cool. Well, that magazine not only had the absolute just treasure trove of data and information for me to dive into. Here's all these other people producing music on computers as well. But it came with a sample CD that had 7.8 gigabytes on a DVD of samples and software, and boom. So I already had a DAW, and I just started stuffing the stuff into it and was like, oh, isn't this cool? Man, I was hooked. This was like, okay, I'd found a community. So then I'd go out and I'd get those magazines every so often. I didn't get every episode, but I'd look at the episodes and think, oh, this is a good one. It's on how to compress vocals or whatever. And then I'd learn from them. And that's how I learned, was a lot of reading and testing and experimenting. This was a little bit of an earlier time where videos were still not as prevalent. But those DVDs came with a producer masterclass tutorial video every single month. And boy, was that the highlight of the month, was you pop one in and you sit there and you watch a guy in his studio talk about how he did his sound, and specifically they almost always broke down a track that they had just finished. They're like, okay, this is my new fresh track, let's walk through it, boom. Or it was multiple producers. There's never one of those I didn't learn from. And even what I mentioned earlier about talking to yourself and writing down a list of things that you want in your track or how you want your track to be is something that I picked up on part from a video. It was John, I wish I could remember his last name. He's a drum and bass producer from England, but in the video, he actually goes off to the pub and he's like, I start always by getting a pint of beer at the pub and sitting down with a notebook and paper, pen and paper, and I write down what I want my song to be before I ever set foot in the studio. And I was like, whoa, that's powerful. Then I come into the studio. Now I've got ideas and they're on paper, and I sit there and I look back at them and I'm like, did I achieve this? I wanted this bass line that really is rumbling. It's like, nope, I've got something else going here. So that's a way to draw yourself to, a level of accountability if you're really trying for something specific. But again, don't hamper creativity. Get in there and then have some component of like, well, I don't know what it'll be. This one question mark. Always leave a blank space for happy accident to happen in there.
Yeah, so I noticed when I did, I've got a project called the Yet Project that I've been working on. It's probably, who knows when it'll come out. There's been a song that I put out on a podcast called Hear You Talking. But for the most part, it's not finished because, so my process of making music has been on my own without anybody else. Two different schools of thought with it. The first one is I'll produce a beat. I'll hear some samples that I like, or I'll have a drum machine that I like, or it'll start with a melody that I like, something from just playing around that I like, and then I'll build from there, right? And it's usually going to be the full instrumental before I even get started writing anything to it. The other school of thought is finding a melody that I like and hearing the vocals already when I find that melody. And so then things kind of get built around the melody and the vocals, and so it's a different type of production style. I don't technically, or I haven't technically limited myself to writing and coming in and trying to do this. It's more like I have this idea that I've recorded maybe on a phone from this. I was just doing something and this popped into my head. And that's kind of where I get most of my inspiration. There's I have so much writing of like, just I'll be doing something and an idea will pop into my head and I'll record it or I'll write it down. I like recording it better because writing it down, I don't get the tempo, I don't get the rhythm, I don't get the cadence. So if I record it, I get all of that, and when I come back, I'm instantly put back in that place. And when I read it, I'm like, how did I say this? What was the vibe of this? I can't remember.
Right.
And so recording a video or an audio clip of it has helped me tremendously. Then the problem is now I've got all of these clips that I don't do anything with. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I've got so much writing and clips and things that are just ideas that I don't know if I'll ever do anything with them. And that's fine. Some of them will translate into a song and they'll years later be like, oh, I need to do something with that, and it'll happen. Other times nothing ever happens from it. And I don't know, maybe there's a level of dedicate yourself of like, you have this, this is good, pick this one and move forward. And I do that. It does kind of make it to the album. Sometimes it's happy accident that they make it to the album. Sometimes it's really like focusing and figuring out this is how I want this to sound. But for the most part, it really is just like, these are done and I like these as a group, and so this is what I'm going to put into the album. But it wasn't really much thought of like, Find My Way was a little different, but on my own, just because it's so many jobs. You've got to record all the different instruments. You've got to be the recording artist and the instrumentalist, and then you've got to write, and then you've got to record that, and then you've got to edit it all together. And so it becomes kind of overwhelming when you say that 90 tracks. You don't want any part of that. When you start recording all these things and you see how much from experience, how much time it took to do all of that, it can be overwhelming to continue down that path over and over again without trying to find a way to streamline it and make it easier.
Yeah. My thing lately is digital space, man. I don't love dealing in hard drives and all this stack of data. And so anytime I can limit how much data it takes to save a session or export one less file or go back through something I don't need anymore and delete it, I am all about that right now. And some people might find that foolish, but I have been a digital asset manager for 2 decades now. In fact, I used to build databases for people who were trying to digitize things, scan it and get it going from companies that dealt in files or whatever, old file cabinets. And I think it's important to take stock of digital file asset management. It's always a component with music and production. So as such, you need to know what's on there and how it's organized. And I still kind of am old school about that. Maybe some people just dump things on the cloud and pay for services. Like I do that, but I also maintain multiple editions of these hard drives and backups, and I do routine backups on them. And so because of that, I think it's important for me to kind of like always be mindful about the amount of information. Like for example, when I was first producing, it was all software based. I was working in the box, and I'd write a simple track. It was a house track. There was no audio files associated with it except for the ones that were already stored in my sample packs. So I didn't have anything to export except for the song. And so there was the song and the sample session that it came from, and that was 436 KB, like nothing. And the song was a MP3 or a dot wave, and it was 10,000 kilobytes, and you're like, okay, no biggie. Then you start working in like bigger sessions, and you're making more, and you're rendering wave files and bringing them back in, and now you've got a singer and you've got an audio, and suddenly like you go to export it, and you're like, oh wow, okay, that whole session together combined with everything was 250 megabytes, or that's when you're lucky. Then I go to school and I start working with actual bands, and we record like 7 songs in an afternoon, and 5 to 10 takes on a song and repunches and blah blah blah, and you're looking at sessions of like 10 to sometimes 30 gigabytes when it was really huge. You're like, what? Huge stuff, right? So file management's important, and if you can cut down on it, or if you can find ways to like limit the amount of shit you've got to keep in this world, you'll be happier. Like I think you gotta look at the long term. We're still young men in a sense, and I think what's the old man gonna have to deal with here, like 50 years later, thinking about files and folders and yeah, that's a podcast for another day. That's a whole topic I can get into on digital.
It's really hard to organize. We talked about this on the phone when we talked about like how do we stay organized, because you have
we
so
use different
much
software, and so you've got to merge. There's online platforms that are trying to help out, but stuff's all very new, and it's like you can't just shift over to using different software to make it convenient. But I like working remotely just as much as I do like working live with people. I think it's really creative, and part of this component, even to the way that I did your remix or to the way that I do other people's stuff, is the same way that I am with audio things, because I was always working on building tracks and like learning from this digital audio workstation. I could take anything, any piece of music, any piece of audio, any file, just drag it into the session and come up with something off it. I could turn it, I could pitch bend it, I could put a beat behind it, I could sidechain it, I could figure something into it, I could make it morph and do different chord progressions or turn into a key or a song or something. So there was like no end to what you could do with the shit. And then I realized, okay, well, if I can do all of that with random meaningless things, it's obviously pretty easy to do it with like stuff that you want to like craft and design into like songs. So then it was easy for me to like kind of learn the art of song building, and I just worked on different styles and learned from there. And that came from
learning how to use that tool and then applying it to the idea that you have. It's absolutely.
But it's also like having a purpose, right? Coming in there and having a purpose. And I say that specifically because I wouldn't tell you anything from the first 3 to 4 years worth of music that I made. It was terrible. I was learning and I was finding my way. But the beautiful part of it was when I started, I was like, I'm different from everybody else, which is how I've always felt. And I thought I won't be bound by any rules or guidelines. So if there was a rule out there, I was like, I don't see the genre line. I'm going to try anything. Okay, nothing is a no man's boundary. Nothing can't be tried. And so I did that. And you'd have a trance song with a jazz bass line, and just. I was all over the place, and I loved it, and I tried every style of music, and it took me a while before I sort of was like, okay, here's what I'm kind of focusing in on a little bit. But you should be that way. You should always start out, don't let anyone tell you about boundaries. And what I learned in school was actually important. They said, all of this stuff is not a rule. This is a guideline of what has worked in the past for someone else doing something similar to what you're doing, right? This is another guy who also uses electronic synthesizers to record these sounds and then put them onto this so that the dance floor and everyone at the club can jump up and down. Similar stuff, similar line here. That's all I'm saying. But you'll learn from that and then figure out what works for you, and you know what I mean.
Right on. Did you take any notes from our last conversation that we were supposed to talk about? I know I asked you to write something down. I don't know if we probably already covered it.
Yeah, I think it was just touching base on the song, right? The actual workflow for the track that you and I did. Maybe a little bit of background, which we delved into. I could always We'd always say more. But yeah, that and maybe there were other topics of conversation we had talked about, like for example, workflow and music technology. Both of them are bottomless pits, but nice to try and put, simple banners on those thoughts.
Yeah, the organization, that's a big one because that's kind of like where I'm running into now is like with multiple people too. Like I've seen one thing to go backwards, you're talking about scanning in files. So I was trying to help somebody scan in some files, and I realized scanning at just 300 dpi and at the highest resolution JPEG, when you print that out or go to read a file like a written document, you can't see it. It's like blurry. So are you exporting as PNG, like a lossless? Is that how you'd be getting those transfer from like a filing cabinet documentation to something to the computer?
That's a great question. I was doing a significant chunk of databasing from like 2007 to 2010, and I honestly don't remember what was the preferred choice back then. It probably would have been whatever was a compressed file format, so maybe even PDFs. But I know that at some point I was batch processing stuff, which meant if I could sit there and spend the time up front to line everything up before I fed it into a scanner, I could then press a button and execute automation so that every file coming in had like sequential numbers on them. With the nomenclature as like an easier way to do it versus scan 1, scan 2, all the way to 50, and then you got to rename every single one. But I don't recall if I was using JPEG, PDIF, or PNG. Yeah, can't even.
Yeah, it's something that I've
even.
just recently started realizing is that some of those written files, like when you have like an art image, it's hard to tell. You almost can't tell. But once you get like actual written, it seems to be kind of degraded around the edges, where like you can tell that it's writing and you can almost make it out. But when you go to zoom in, it's so blurry that it's not.
Check your scan software and check your settings because it's possible you can either import it as a document versus an actual image file, or that there are DPI settings on there. I know the scanner I've got's not great, but it still enables me to get like all different kind of selections on there if I want. If I'm doing like color, or if I'm doing photos, or if I'm doing documents, black and white. Obviously, at the end of the day, it's still a pretty lousy quality in my opinion when it scans it, but that's what I'm talking specific. I've been doing a lot of photo projects and art production, and it sucks when it comes to color, so that's different.
So back to the organization. So like one of the things I've been trying to do, we were talking about before the podcast as well, chronology of your music career and whatnot. And so my website that I built, it's not necessarily chronological, pretty close, but it's a place it's a portfolio to document all of my musical journey, right, or my art journey. I want to have a hard drive that I have all of my finished work on, like 100% of all the finished stuff. That way I can put that and connect it to a server and be able to share it however I want or whatever. That's not really an issue. It's just taking the time to do it. The issue is organizing everything in a way that works to be able to go back through it. So, with right before this to get Skype on and all that stuff that I was trying to get going, I realized that my phone was just full and I needed to empty it before I could really do anything else, because I thought that would also affect the performance. If you're using more than half of your hard drive, whatever. So I emptied all that out, but when I dump my files, I don't know where to put them. It's a ton of different files. There's screenshots, there's downloads, there's pictures, there's files from us sending back and forth. So I put them in a dump folder and then hope to one day go back through and organize them, but then I don't. And now I've just got hundreds of dump folders that I don't know what's in them. I don't know what's in them.
Yeah, man, you're either on top of it on that one or not. You're the guy like everybody I see out there. I don't know, my phone says it's got 11,000 photos in here. I'm like, what? Well, I don't want to get into this, but I will tell you that for the last X number of years, since my first flip phone until now, or whether it's a hard drive or being online or anything, I am obsessive when it comes to digitally managing these assets. And so once a month, if not more frequently, I take my phone, plug it in, take all the files off of there, and drag it onto the computer, from where it then goes into my master archive folders, which are on multiple backups, right? So like I have a big hard drive that's like documents incoming, photos, audio file recordings, if I'm like recording shit off my cell phone, and at the end of each month it gets dumped. Now, do I use all this stuff? Probably not, but at least it's going into these parented folders where it's like, here's all my photos. Guess what? This phone sequentially numbers the photos, and it's a nomenclature that I've adapted to because it's actually year, date, month, time. Beautiful system. So I started that about 7 or 8 years ago. Everything is chronological. It doesn't matter if it's a video, if it's a photo. If it's a document, it's in a separate documents folder, but these photos just like that. So that's something I do. You have to do it regularly, and it's a little bit of work, and most people won't do that. They'll be like, no, I got an iPhone, let's plug it in, or I sync it to the cloud or whatever. Well, that's fine if you don't want to micromanage. If you want full control, and I have a rooted Android, so I can pretty much just drag and drop Windows folders, whatever. I also use Mac, and it's all plug and play compliant. It's fun, it's friendly, it's mostly good. But you do have to stay up to date with stuff, and that's the one area I've lapsed in myself since having graduated school and having been way more engaged with what was fresh technology then versus now where you have to afford it on your own.
And I mean, we're talking from experience of like, when I do a podcast on before I got this set up, now that I'm bringing it all out in 2 tracks, basically, I was recording multiple camera angles, multiple microphone, and I by the end of editing, I could literally be 80, 100 gigabytes. And it's just not manageable to do that. So then it's like, how do we crunch down so that I can only be a couple gigabytes per podcast? Because eventually,
right.
I'm only 35 or 6 or 7 podcasts in. What about when I'm at 100? I mean, I can't manage 100 gigabyte podcast. That's 1,000 gigabytes or 100,000 gigabytes. It's not manageable.
I mean, you probably have to do what I do when it comes to. So I snowboard, right? And I'm in the mountains, and that's the primary function of any GoPro on filming and footage that we do. It's snowboarding and mountain climbing related. And we come home with weekend's trip, and here's all these SD cards full of stuff or whatever. We're shooting, and I'm the guy sitting there organizing through all this stuff. What I've actually gotten to a point of doing was shooting all the footage, editing it down, and then kissing my edit and kissing the rest of it goodbye. It's like, we're not going to come back. We're not going to retool all old used footage. These guys aren't getting sponsored, and when the sponsor gets them on their team, they don't want their old footage. They want anything from the raw edit, and they'll make new scenes. So I do have some stuff that I haven't deleted that's probably 250 gigs of the early days, but pretty much all edits end in the final result, followed by me deleting all of the project, the session, whatever associated files, and I
keep
it
deleting the session.
Yeah, it's a committed move, dude. It's like the way that you compress vocals. That's a very committed move for me, because I know I'm not ever going to be capable of coming back to it. And also, if I put a soundtrack on there, now I have even less. So usually what I do is I bounce 2 versions. I always have one clean and one soundtrack, and I save those. But if you want to redo something, you can't. You just have to commit to what edits you have, and then say, hey, here's our edit. And then now in my edits folder, snowboard videos, I've got 22 videos. Snowboard footage, I can just say done or whatever. The only ones that live in there are the ones I haven't translated into videos yet. We have 8 or 10 sessions from the last 3 years that have all just been sitting, not been produced yet.
So my school of thought has always been to keep everything. It's like you might want to go back, and hard drives are so cheap at this point. Just keep everything. But
if you're willing to stockpile on your shelves and have a shelf of hard drives and be that guy, and you don't mind spending the money, or 10 years from now be like, oh my god, I spent $6,000 and I have 40 hard drive. But that's fine. I will say this. There is a second side to everything, and the professional approach is what you're saying. And to describe that specifically from the studio standpoint, in the days of tape, every person who came into the studio had a little shoebox on the shelf with all of their stuff. So, when Donna Summers came in to record whatever song it was, they would run the tape for her, right? And at the end of the night, that tape would then be taken out and placed back into the box. And along with the tape would be the session liner notes that showed what all the settings were on the board. I said track 16 was run to the MX200 with 5 decibels of gain and blah blah blah. When it was all said and done, everything got put in there. They said which mics they used in the stage plot, and then put that on the shelf. And then she comes back in and says, I want to do another take. Boom, they pull that off the shelf. Here's everything that it has. They can draw it up on the session board. They do another take. Or the next guy wants to do a remix, better still. The box gets sent down to dude's house at his session, he draws it up, he makes a remix on it. That's how it was done. We then went digital. I still do the same thing. In my box, which is now a folder on Windows or on Mac, inside of there you'll have, excuse me, one folder that's going to have your audio files, any associated recordings, simple and plain. Another folder that's going to have any project sessions, so digital audio workstation sessions that you've used to produce the song. And then the third folder typically will have rendered versions of the song, whether that's MP3s, waves, whatever you need. Mm-hmm. I do my own album artwork. I do my own artwork for my music and product releases. So sometimes I like to take a version, the final copy of the artwork, and I put that in the folder right next to that too, so that in case I want to double click it and hit play, the artwork's right there. But typically speaking, all of my artwork lives in its own folder, which is organized the same as my music with its production, and then there's a section in there for album covers, and each one has its own. Because in the album cover artwork, you then have the same thing: Photoshop session, Photoshop assets, Photoshop exports, final versions, etc. Simple type of formula.
And just helping yourself stay a little bit more organized as you're recording so that you aren't having to do it retroactively.
Yeah, you don't want to waste or you don't want to take away time or energy from the moment when energy strikes and you and your buddy are sitting there and you're trying to produce a track, and then suddenly you're like, damn it, and now you're clicking through some folders looking for something to get it, and the energy gets lost. Mm-hmm. And that's something I'm like constantly battling. Like, that comes back to know where your samples are, know what's in each pack. When you have a quick inspiration to mind, know what's the quick tool to bring up to make it work, right? Because otherwise you lose the energy and somebody's sitting there staring at a computer screen. That's one side of things. The other side is some people are performers, and sometimes the energy is a bit more physical. I'm working with a guy now who's a performer. He doesn't really like to look at computers that much. He'll sit here for a bit, but if there's not a guitar going or a drum machine or something, he just loses interest. So that keeps a fire on me to be like active, and that's kind of cool. You know, different style of production.
Yeah. Well, hey man, I really appreciate you being on the podcast. I don't want to keep you all day. I know you probably got some stuff to do. Is there anything you want to add?
I think some of the topics we've touched on, we should revisit and delve into. So let's call this part one. There's definitely things I would like to talk on, including my own history of music.
And I meant to get into more of that too, and there was just so much to talk about that
I think the bottom line is why it's interesting that I'm even in music and produce it all, because I'm the least likely candidate. But if I can do it, anyone can do it, right? So that would be fun. But there's other stuff too, with the audio industry, and yeah, it'd be fun to get into and talk about.
Yeah, I'd love to have you back on so we can dig more into your own personal stuff. I mean, obviously this time we've got a couple tracks coming out, and I wanted to talk to you about a bunch of other stuff. And I mean, we could talk for another hour or two just on your personal experience of how you've grown to be who you are. And so hopefully we can do that again down the road if you're open to that. Maybe.
Yeah, I would like to do that. I'd like to hear more on your side of things too, hear about some of your background and some of the music projects you're doing, maybe what your vision for the future is, and your engagement with audio industry at large, that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. Musical technology, how that plays a role, and what you find yourself comfortable with and not, and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Just my own thoughts. But so and then obviously like musical projects and future collaborations. Like I just flipped through your folder the other day and was like, oh my gosh, here's 14 songs I haven't even looked at or toyed with, and I'm sure I could easily remix a few of those too. So
and so I still have a couple of songs, like I said, from stuff that you sent me, Darker Block and Streetwalker, I believe, that I'm working on. I just haven't had time to really mess with them. But maybe once we finish that up, maybe we can get you back on and talk a little bit about that and dig deeper into all this stuff.
Definitely, very fun and super interactive, enjoyable. It'd be cool to get a couple comments, couple questions, get a couple listener interactions, get this thing out there. But
you can add that stuff to the next time. Maybe if anybody's got any video questions or anything, they can submit and I can add them in. If anybody found this to be helpful or interesting, let us know. So that's it for us, man. Thank you very much for tuning in to the PeaceSum podcast. Stay tuned. We're going to have a couple songs. And everybody going
Join me on a trip. On a trip. On a trip. On a trip. A little something like 1985. Struggling but I'm alive. Now I got you feeling the vibe. Take a walk in my mind and show you what's inside. Nowhere to hide, like when universes collide. Earth is where I reside, and everybody wanna join the tribe. You've been on a ride, somebody sold you a dream, looks like they lied. Got too much pride, with so many problems that you can't hide. Far and wide, so many enemies used to be on your side. All odds divide, a deep enough apology you can't provide. All the time that you can't buy, stress and the damage caused by the tide. Lost and denied, what you gon' do? Broke down and cried. Don't just follow the guide, find another exercise you ever tried. Only you can decide, can't be prepared with no effort applied. Could've lived, could've died, done the best with the tools I've been supplied. Always said if I survive, I find a way to share where it's unified. Where it's unified, where it's unified.
We want peace, no more enemies. We just want peace. We want peace, no more enemies. We just want peace. We want peace in the streets and the Middle East. Somebody tell the shooters and the police, all of the violence, when will it cease? People starving, laying on the streets. We wanna own, don't wanna lease. And we steady come with the insight we seek. Tell the way we standing by the way we speak. We want peace, no more enemies. Greatest to the least, everybody's out just trying to get a piece. Somebody go and get the priest, both black and white, 6 feet deep. And I pray they resting in peace, cause thought product just killed them with a piece. No more enemies, we just want peace. No more enemies, we just want peace. Can we get along with unity in the community? Mix some more belief than you can see. Don't you wonder what we could be if we could learn to free our minds from the negativity? Who will need a GMO free food to feed? Open up a damn book and read. There's a light to lead, take every seed of a dying breed. But it can never be enough to fill the greed. Don't wanna give us none, and to keep us under the gun. Ain't no fun, 4 against 1, like it was over before it begun. Thinking that they won, but it's easier said than done. Wait, it can feel like a ton, when nobody cares, you're the only one. I don't mean to cut and run, but I'm done with the lies they spun. We want peace, where we're going and where we're from. We want peace, to the old and young. We want peace, through the rising sun.
Nobody's perfect, but the work is it's worth it. Pick the baby up, then you burp it, far below the surface. Way before the first kiss, starts off long before the first bits. Got shit that I'm gonna do it every day. Born with it, give you wish it go away. On a remix, no do, don't play. Joe and P, that is yeah, we here to stay. If it's not a yay, then it's probably a nay. If you wanna go, ain't gon' make you stay.